Donald Trump is reportedly furious because he is slowly understanding that the Russians are playing him, especially Putin, in regards to the ceasefire, because they don't actually want a ceasefire. We'll talk about this as well as about anything else that has happened along the front lines and behind them in this situation report about the war in Ukraine. Surfshark VPN is sponsoring this channel for this month. If you want to bypass geo-blocking or hide your internet activity all with a convenient app, then use Surfshark VPN for just $2.09 a month by using my link. You get 4 months extra as well. Thank you, Surfshark, for sponsoring this channel. The German tabloid Bild is reporting that the Russians are using now their Shahid drones in a different and more effective way. The drones are now gathering close to the target in an altitude of several kilometers. They are circling around until a bigger number has arrived, and then they start diving onto the city together in a coordinated way. This means that as the majority of the Ukrainian air defense against those drones is based on barreled weapons, so anti-tank, anti-aircraft tanks like the Gepard, a lot of them are small fire teams on technicals with 50 cal machine guns, something like this. The drones thus remain out of reach for those weapons while they are circling in a high altitude. This means that all those smaller teams are completely incapable of striking those drones, and the drones themselves are obviously quite visible on the radar screen, but they can only now be attacked with surface-to-air missiles, of which Ukraine doesn't have enough. During the dive itself, they can obviously be struck, but there an oversaturation of the air defense is happening, and at the same time the speed is probably significantly higher as well of those drones as they are gathering speed while diving. So this means that they become more effective. And if we look at the numbers, this seems to be true. Recently, for instance, the numbers of drones that are getting through is increasing. For instance, on the 29th through the 30th of March, the Ukrainians were reporting 111 Shahid being used against them. 65 of them were shot down. 34 were lost, as the Ukrainians call it. That's usually been understood as being defeated with electronic warfare. But that means 12 have been left. In the past, those have been numbers by the Ukrainians of 1 to 5. A very small number, and then of course we should factor in some potential for propaganda on the Ukrainian side. But now the Ukrainians in this attack, for instance, they admit that 12 have gotten through and thus struck their target. That's more than 10%. That is an unheard success quote of Shahid drones in this example. We'll have to observe this in the future, but this might be a simple adjustment done by the Russians. Obviously, flying higher makes them much more vulnerable to bigger air defense, but for that you need enough air defense missiles to be able to actually achieve that, to be actually successful to shoot them down. We'll switch to the developments along the front line here. And here we start with the Kursk area. Now, I have no new reports when it comes to the areas where the Russians have entered Ukraine and to Kursk itself. I think the map here is wrong. Like I said in the last time, the Russians have definitely taken the border post here, but we have fresh geolocations from the area where the Ukrainians have entered Kursk. And here we see the Ukrainians in the western part of Popavka and in the eastern part. So very likely Popavka is now under Ukrainian control, or at the very least, Ukrainians have presence all over it. Obviously, geolocations don't necessarily mean that the Ukrainians have now gained a foothold there. It just means they have been there, but now we have seen them all over Popavka. But that was it from that whole area over the past 2 days. I cannot confirm any additional changes. We switch to the Kharkiv area, and here again the usual fighting is being reported. No change can be confirmed. On the eastern front, we have a change in the area roughly of Kupiansk. Here, north of Stepova Novoselivka, we have a change. Here, if we see, it's roughly a little bit to the west of the north, so somewhere here, and this is the river, so the Russians have roughly reached this point. Fairly insignificant, a small tactical success, but a success nonetheless. nonetheless. Further south in the area of Terni, roughly, we have the Russians advancing further in the direction of Nove. They roughly gained this here and this over the past few days, where they have achieved sizable advances west of the Sherebets River, which goes from north to south here. They have advanced to the outskirts of Katerinivka and are close to Nove since those last advances. But that was it north of the Seversky Donetsk. South, I cannot confirm anything. I have no reports of advances in the Seversk direction or at Chasiv Yar, so we switch to Toretsk, and here in Toretsk we have new geolocations. We have the Russians operating north of the city itself. We have Russian presence now in the high-rises next to the stadium. This was one of the positions where the Ukrainians had a foothold throughout the time until recently. Those two buildings, even when the Russians were operating all over Toretsk itself, those two buildings were still occupied by the Ukrainians. Now we have geolocations of the Russians being in the northern one. To which degree Ukrainians are still in the northern building or in the southern building, I cannot confirm as of now, but we see that now the Russians are advancing in this area as well. That was it from Toretsk itself. To the west of it, the Russians have taken Panteleymonivka, the town here. And fighting is continuing in Oleksandropil. We have geolocation of this as well, where the Russians and the Ukrainians were battling in the center of the town. In the recent geolocation, the Ukrainians were still in Oleksandropil, fighting with Russian soldiers, despite Panteleymonivka already taken. Whether they have evacuated it by now, there's no way for me to confirm it. We would see it over the next few days. Obviously, it becomes increasingly relevant whether or not the Ukrainians should abandon Oleksandropil, but we'll see that over the next few days. That's it from this area here. We go further to the Pokrovsk area. Here we have the Ukrainians being confirmed west of Shevchenko. In a recent geolocation, they have operated here. That doesn't mean that now suddenly they have retaken Shevchenko. We just know that Ukrainians were recently back at this point as well. And to the west of it, the Russians have taken the town of Uspenivka, or at the very least have operated throughout it. So it's probably at the very least a contested area, a gray zone by now. But the Ukrainian presence is no longer really significant inside of the town, as the Russians are advancing throughout it and have reached the outskirts of Novo-Oleksandrivka over the past few days. That was it from Pokrovsk. We have further advanced by the Russians on the town of Rosliv. We have geolocation here as well, where the Russians have reached the eastern part of the town. As you can see, the pro-Ukrainian deep state map says that several parts of the town are now under solid Russian control. I have not seen a geolocation of this except for that one position in the eastern part, but then again, a pro-Ukrainian site admitting Ukrainian defeat makes it likely. So Rosliv is probably about to fall if this map is somewhere close to the reality. The Ukrainians are heavily under pressure here, and Rosliv will probably fall in the near future. That was it with territorial changes in the north here, and we have some report from the Zaporizhzhia front. There the Ukrainians are talking about an increased usage of mechanized forces by the Russians, but still no confirmation of change in territory that can be observed over the past few days. We go to the overall situation, and here the Ukrainians are saying the Russians will likely start a new offensive in the coming weeks to increase the pressure in regards to the ceasefire negotiations, because obviously if they are increasing their advances on the ground, then they have the argument with the US, you want ceasefire, you can't expect us to make a ceasefire when we are advancing, so if you want a ceasefire, then we need to get what we want. I guess that would be the idea behind it, as Trump is bound to get a ceasefire no matter what, and for that he obviously needs to address the interests of both parties, the wishes, and if the Russians are significantly advancing on the ground, their argument would then be, then give us what we would otherwise take. That seems to be the intention here by the Russians. Zelensky was saying, was talking about potential offensives in the direction of Sumy, Kharkiv, and of Zaporizhzhia. So he speaks about 3 potential offensives. Whether or not the Russians are actually capable of running 3 simultaneous offensives here that are supposedly gaining ground as well is a different story. And at the same time, the Ukrainians are reporting that there's increased reconnaissance in Pokrovsk and that the Russians are regaining strength there. So the attacks there are supposed to intensify somewhere soon as well. That would be a fourth front where we should expect additional offensive activity by the Russians. Whether the Russians are capable, we will have to see. That was it in this regard. We have in troop generation, we have news here. TASS, the Russian state media, the Russian media published this here. According to them, they have entered a new handheld drone into service. It's launched by hand. And it's supposedly only costs 100,000 rubles. That's roughly $1,000. Has 50 kilometers of range and carries a 1.7 kilogram warhead that is then being able to fly significantly behind the front line. In the political sphere, that's probably the main topic of these days now. In the political sphere, the negotiations between the US and Ukraine are continuing about ceasefires, how to implement it, how to get the details. Russia is continuing to claim that Ukrainian oil and gas installations are legitimate targets, while they themselves demand that their own oil and gas installations are excluded inside of a ceasefire agreement. Then once again, you see how the Russians, like what we are talking about for the past weeks, that the Russians basically don't give an inch but demand more and more from the Ukrainians and thus from the Americans as well. Then we have the report here that apparently this message is arriving in the White House. We have NBC here. Trump says he's very angry and pissed off at Putin during NBC News interview. Trump is understanding that the ceasefire, that the Russians have no interest in ceasefire, and he is now talking about potential sanctions if the ceasefire is not finally on its way. The Ukrainians have already said that they are fully willing to do a ceasefire over the whole front line. The Russians don't even think about doing that. Trump is increasingly angered by this, and he also complains that the Russians keep addressing and claiming that Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, is not legitimate, which he is according to the Ukrainian constitution. And he is now threatening if there will be no deal, then there will be secondary sanctions against every oil that's coming from Russia. So directly 25 to 50% in tariffs. But obviously the US won't import much oil from Russia. But he's talking about the potential that the US would sanction all nations and companies that do business in regards to doing business with the US if they buy Russian oil. So any Indian company that buys Russian oil is no longer allowed to do business with the US. Whether or not this will be enough to stop to punish the Russians, we'll have to see. But Trump is increasingly getting angry with Putin as he slowly is understanding that Putin is not interested in making a ceasefire. Before that, the reports were there that that Trump was threatening in the direction of Kiev. He was saying that Kiev, if it doesn't sign the resource agreement, he threatened consequences for Kiev there as well. We talked about it in the last situation report that the new resource agreement is basically a colonial contract, except that colonial powers were willing to defend their colonies, which the US isn't. So the current resource agreement will very likely not be signed by the Kiev government. So we'll have to see how this turns as well. But as said, reports were saying that the patience of Trump is running thin with Putin. To which degree his pressure, his intended pressure, will be sufficient is a different story. We've spoken here in the past that Putin could be put under pressure by Trump simply by increasing the weapon deliveries towards Ukraine and thus bettering the Ukrainian position on the field. But that is apparently something that Trump is not willing to do. In international support, the Ukrainian President Zelensky said that a coalition of the willing, that includes 30 nations, wants to give Ukraine extended informations in regards to reconnaissance and intelligence. So they have some way of at least mitigating the loss in case of a US drawdown in this regard as well. They will also give additional access to ammunition depots according to the Ukrainian president, and the Ukrainians will receive licenses for the production of weapon systems from the West. The type of weapon systems was not mentioned though, which would obviously be the big questions. Also, investment will happen in regards to drones and to missiles, according to the Ukrainian president. And the Swedes have made a new aid package at the size of roughly $1.6 billion. It's the biggest so far that Sweden has done. The majority of the money will be used for weaponry that are being bought for Ukraine. So apparently we're talking about fresh production now, no longer storage equipment, but an order of 1.6 billion or up to 1.6 billion in the defense industry for new equipment for the Ukrainians. Sweden is also investing 7.5 million into drone production, and the Danish are investing 43.5 million into Ukrainian innovation funds that is developing electronic warfare and drone systems next to other things. That's it though for today. For today's situation report, rather shorter because the majority of the topic is circling around the ceasefire negotiations. Still, if you like this situation report, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. If you have something to add, use the comment section. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.